Looking into the end of Act 2, then, we come to Hamlet's second soliloquy, in which we get a further examination of how Hamlet actually feels, both about himself here and about his situation. So this somewhat gross picture is a Salvador Dali drawing, I suppose, that deals with what this kind of self-reflection looks like. It's gazing into oneself, but it involves this kind of ripping and tearing that you see pictured here. Hamlet in this soliloquy is kind of dealing through three things. So there's a lot of criticism of himself in this soliloquy, and we'll look for noticings of that. He deals a lot with the difference between things of form and things of substance, and he also expresses a great sense of what we could either define as skepticism or discernment. So with those kind of three ideas to outline our soliloquy, we'll take a deeper dive into it. So as soon as he's alone, he criticizes himself, what a rogue and peasant slave I am. And then he spends the majority of the first part of his soliloquy upset at himself in comparison to this actor who he's just watched perform this scene from the Aeneid. In the Aeneid, the stories of Aeneas who escapes the destruction of Troy to found eventually the city of Rome. And during this piece that Hamlet asked to be performed, the player gives a monologue about the death of Priam. And Priam's the king of Troy. And Priam is killed by Pyrrhus, who is Achilles' son. And there's some confusing lineage things here. But all this to say, Pyrrhus is killing Priam, the king of Troy, out of revenge for the death of Achilles. And Pyrrhus comes in, grabs Priam by the hair, drags him across these blood-soaked streets of Troy to the altar at the center of Troy, and slaughters this old man there on the altar. This is probably something Hamlet has asked to have performed for him so that he can relive this same level of vengeance that he needs to be able to perform. He himself is readying himself to murder Claudius, and so he asks for some quasi-historical precedent for that seen in the death of Priam by the vengeful hands of Pyrrhus. But it's Hecuba that really gets the player upset. And Hecuba is Priam's wife, who, after the death of Priam, wanders the city as a grieving widow, crying. And Hamlet says, I'm watching this guy perform this scene, and he himself is getting emotional in his acting. As he tells this story, he's beginning to cry, and tears are in his eyes, and distraction in his aspect, a broken voice, his whole function suiting with forms to his conceit. And Hamlet says, how is it that this guy is able to show more emotional connectivity to Hecuba, a fictional character, than I am, he says, in relation to my own father who's been murdered. And he says, what would this guy do had he the motive and cue for passion that I have? If this guy is going to get this upset over Hecuba, a fictional character, a dream of passion, what would he act like if he actually was dealing with the kind of suffering that Hamlet is dealing with? So Hamlet continues and says, well, what does that say about me then? If this actor can get all worked up over a fiction, I can't even get worked up over my father. He says, I must be a really horrible person that I can't make myself act for a king, right? For somebody who has experienced this horrible tragedy. And so he says, I'm pigeon-livered. I lack gall to make oppression bitter. The sense here is of him being this cowardly, weak-willed person who's unable to act at all. And then he falls a curse in here to all these huge proclamations: bloody, bawdy villain, remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain, all this yelling comes down from that rant to say, what an ass am I? You can read some sarcasm in these lines then. This is most brave. Look how brave this is, that I am unpacking my heart with words, right? And this is where the same theme of form versus substance comes into play. As Hamlet says, it's just words. There's no substance here. It's all this, all these forms. It's just superficial stuff. It doesn't have any action behind it. If you remember your Macbeth, you'll remember that Macbeth, working himself up to kill Duncan, has this huge soliloquy. He sees a bloody dagger, but then he starts pulling in all these horrible allusions. He talks about wolves and witches. He talks about these infamous criminals from Roman mythology. And at the end, he shakes himself off and he says, whilst I threat, he, that is Duncan, lives. Words to the heat of deeds, too cold breath gives. Whilst I threat, he lives. Words to the heat of deeds, too cold breath gives. And Macbeth knew, if I keep talking about this, nothing's going to get done. I got to just make it happen. If I keep talking, I'm going to cool off the heat of action. Hamlet says, I'm doing that. I'm doing that too. I'm just unpacking my heart with words. And he compares himself, and if you're sensitive to the imagery in this scene, there's been a lot of conversation about prostitutes in this scene. And Hamlet himself now compares himself to a whore in this simile. The suggestion of, again, sort of a false face, that he is putting forward a guise that is not who he truly is. And he's unpacking his heart through these semantics, through this superficiality, instead of actually having the action that this emotion necessitates. And so he ends this section saying, about my brains, which is like, turn around my brain. Stop going in this one direction. Focus your mind on a plan. And so here's the plan. The plan is he's going to put on a play, and we'll see in Act 3 a play within a play that will essentially be the murder of King Hamlet by Claudius. So it'll be the same way that Claudius killed Hamlet, presented in a play. And he says, and I'll watch Claudius. Claudius blenches. If he pales, if he looks upset, then I'll know that he actually killed King Hamlet. And he says at the end, I'll have grounds more relative than this, which means I'll have surer grounds that Claudius is in fact the man who murdered my father. The next bit is an interesting bit for us. It's kind of difficult to discern how we should best interpret this. He says, the spirit that I have seen, referring to the ghost of his father, may be a devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape. Yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. Hamlet says, man, if there's anything that I know after Act 2, it's that I am in a bad spot. I used to see the world as beautiful. I see it as a foul congregation of vapors. I used to see people as wonderful. I see them now as a quintessence of dust. He says, I'm in the perfect place for something to play tricks on me. I'm vulnerable. I'm weak. I'm depressed in my weakness and my melancholy. And he says, it's possible a devil is showing up and saying, yeah, go murder Claudius, knowing that in my weakness, I'm more likely to say yes. And so he says, I'm going to try to figure this out for myself. I'm going to use reason in this. I think if you wanted to look at this negatively, you could say, Hamlet, you've just said, like, you should be going about the business that your ghost father has called you to. You should not just be saying words. You should be acting. You just criticized yourself for how you haven't done anything. Act 1 ended with the ghost's clear command, revenge my most foul and unnatural murder. Act 2, you've just been fooling around the whole act, playing with, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, reciting poetry. Like, what are you doing? Are you doubting your father? Are you finding, or are you just being like skeptical? Are you being cowardly? Or are you, again, trying to find ways to push off this thing you need to do? You know that what you should be doing is killing Claudius, and you don't want to, and so you're finding excuses to be hesitant. That's maybe a way to look at this in the negative. In the positive, we could say, well, Hamlet is super self-aware. Look at his willingness to recognize that he's not seeing things correctly. How often does that happen? When you're upset, are you simultaneously aware of the fact that you're upset and that's clouding your vision? When you're angry and you say mean things to the people who you care about, isn't it when we cool down that we go back and say, hey, I wasn't thinking right at that time. I was upset. I was angry. I shouldn't have said those things to you, but it was because, I wasn't seeing things clearly because I was mad. Hamlet says, I am simultaneously aware of two things. I am both weak and melancholy, and because of that, I'm seeing things in a way that they are actually not. And that's unique. That's a self-awareness that we don't often see. He's also discerning here because he recognizes that what the ghost is asking him to do is bad. There's a moral qualm that he has about murdering Claudius. Macbeth, for instance, when the Weird Sisters show up and say, you're going to be king, Macbeth never questions the Weird Sisters. There's never a time when he wonders, Are these people telling me the truth? Are they not telling me the truth? He's more concerned with how he's going to achieve the crown, but he never doubts that he very quickly believes the Weird Sisters. Even when Banquo says that these beings are often used to tempt people and to lead them to destruction, Macbeth doesn't have that discerning bone in his body. Hamlet does. Even in his own weakness, even in the tragedy of his circumstances, Hamlet's like, I don't know that I can trust myself to not be taken advantage of in this moment.